There's a really good quote by Krishnamurti, which says, "The day you teach the child the name of a bird, that child will never see that bird again." And what this basically is saying is that when a child sees a bird, they have no, and this is like, it's not necessarily a specific bird, but you imagine seeing a bird for the first time and you don't know what it is. You will experience it as like raw subjectivity. There will be like an aesthetic to the way it flies, a color perception, maybe a combination of certain colors. If it lands and you get closer to it and you see its face and you watch the way it kind of hops as it moves, there's kind of like an infinite, like unbounded way of perceiving that thing, and it's much beyond any kind of symbol or flat way of perceiving it when you attach a label to it and call it a bird, call it like a bluebird or whatever, a blue jay. I don't know birds. Blue jay, yeah. And so then when you're seeing that and you have this like infinite wonder and curiosity, and you think of the way you see a kid look at something that is mundane to you, that happens fairly often. You'll see a kid like sticking their head into a bush and just being fascinated by something, and you're thinking like, dude, let's go. We gotta go get to McDonald's before the breakfast ends or whatever. But and then the kid's seeing the thing and then you go, that's a blue jay, right? That's a blue jay. And then they're like, oh. And then the next time they see it, rather than that infinite wonder, they have, oh, that's a blue jay. And then it collapses into this symbol. And that's actually like the core concept of non-duality, if you're interested in it. But I want to take this concept and apply it to a problem that I'm noticing in books and TV shows. So I'll use some concrete examples of this, but to frame this a little bit, like I was watching YouTube videos where people were arguing that modern books are bad. And if I wanted to boil down what they were kind of saying, is that they're saying a lot of books are bad because they're trying to be woke. And like it's not really that simple, though. I would argue whatever, like, I mean, I'll say like outright, like my political ideology is that that I hope Donald Trump gets assassinated, but also that I'm not like going to blindly accept every single left-wing black or white issue. And this is kind of the thing with the bird, is like, you have one of the biggest problems we have in modern society, I think, is that we have this kind of black and white, we have these like left and right buckets that things get assigned into. So like COVID hits, and then suddenly taking any precaution whatsoever against COVID becomes a left-wing bucket, and being staunchly against any precaution whatsoever, it becomes right-wing. And there's no real reason that it had to go that way. Like, I mean, I guess it kind of makes sense, right? Like, because taking precautions is like we see that as like a right-wing people don't like government overreach ostensibly, but of course they are totally fine with government overreach when it's for something that they think is good. So it kind of could have gone either way. Like, in some sense, traditionally left-wing people have been more about I don't know. It's hard to say, right? Because sometimes anti-vax stuff becomes left-wing, and like it's almost like a horseshoe thing. Some of the biggest anti-vaxxers are actually left-wing, but then that flipped during COVID, and I think now it's like totally right-wing. But the point is, we have this tendency where if you say, oh, I vote Democrat, then it's in some sense, if somebody says they vote Democrat, you know what their viewpoint is on every single issue. and that's not really the case, but it feels that way a lot of the time. So when people are complaining like, oh, books are bad because they're woke, or they're trying to be woke, I would agree in some sense that, like, if you look at the overall trends, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, the trends tend to be like the books that get recognition, the books that publishers choose to let through, do tend to be left-leaning, like on different issues. And they tend to, and here's where I'm going to come in with the actual problem, is that they tend to, it's not really that they are, that when you experience the book or the story or whatever as like the raw subjective input, when you just say, I don't know anything about this story, I'm going to read it, I'm going to treat the characters as complex individuals who are going through a nuanced conflict, and they're going to have, you know, like, there's not going to be an obvious political like slant to it or something, and I'm going to experience that, and then at the end of that story I'm going to think to myself like, okay, what is the takeaway here, or whatever. And then that takeaway would be something that you as an individual kind of synthesize yourself based on your own experience going through that conflict through the eyes of various characters and their interactions with each other and the conflict, etc. But with what kind of I think is the problem, and what people are pointing out is like books trying to be woke, is what you kind of get is more of a signaling some kind of prepackaged position by doing certain things, or even certain types of like it starts with the marketing, honestly, and it becomes an issue of like gatekeeping as well, where the publishers are, you know, as an example, publishers, if you're trying to publish sci-fi or fantasy, do you think you're going to be more likely to get published if your character is a, let's say, a Black trans woman, and the conflict is deeply rooted in misogyny, and you yourself are an Indigenous queer woman? Or do you think you're going to get more, or are you more likely to get published if you have a white male protagonist and you're a white male? Like, and I'm not saying this isn't me as a white male like complaining about this. It's just like I'm pointing out that in the current publishing landscape, there are certain types of like themes that they are much more interested in publishing, and it's not actually about like you read the book and then like you read the book as a raw experience, and then after you finish the book and you've like contemplated it and really let it sit with you, you then realize like, oh, you know, that really had a that story really made me understand the like what it really means to be a trans woman in this society or whatever, like right, it's not like you have that post hoc realization and you realize like, wow, now that I really have like fully processed and had that experience, I understand like what it means to be Black so much deeper now that I did that. I don't think that's what's happening. What's happening instead is we're getting these kind of like flattened versions of people being like, oh, well, I'm going to make my main character a lesbian. And it's like, they do it, but it's not really done very well. And it doesn't really, there's no like real insight about being a lesbian within the story. It's just kind of there. And it ends up kind of just serving as the marketing in a sense. But let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about that I think we'll do a better example of arguing my point rather than just giving general examples. So the Wheel of Time TV show came out a few years ago and it got canceled after 3 seasons. I will say that the first season was really bad, but by the 3rd season they had really started to turn things around, and the show was actually getting really good, and then they canceled it, but they had messed up too much in the beginning. So but I'm going to give you just one example from that show that I think really demonstrates my point. So I will avoid spoilers as much as I can. I've been rereading the book for the past year or so, the series of books, and there were more than 10 books. So they 100% needed to make changes to the show to make the show work. It was not going to be possible for them to keep it completely book accurate. Now, given that though, the changes that they needed to make, I think, for the book to work, for the show to work, we're going to be cutting things out. You're going to have to cut stuff out, obviously, but you probably want to make as few changes as you have to. And that's not what they did. So in the book, and I'm going to avoid using as many in-book names as possible. So in the book, Aes Sedai are these magic wizard women. And I'll just say wizard lady instead. There's a wizard lady named Moraine. And she knows that there was this chosen one. The chosen one is called the dragon. So the dragon died he's not a dragon, he's just a human, but they call him the dragon. And he died 3,000 years ago. And then there was a prophecy that he would be reborn. And then shortly after he was reborn, there would be Armageddon, and he would have to fight basically Satan or the Dark One or whatever. And so she follows all these clues from the prophecy, etc. And she realizes that the dragon has been reborn in a town called the Two Rivers. So she goes there. When she arrives, she knows that the dragon was born at a certain time, 17 years ago, and that it's going to be a boy, and that she'll know him when she sees him, basically, because it will be there's this concept called Taviran in the book, and it really serves as dude, this light is hitting me really weird now. Taviran is this, it's basically an in-lore, in-universe excuse to have plot armor. It actually works pretty well within the story, but telling you that it's Taviran is an excuse to give plot armor, it sounds kind of goofy, but it does. Just trust me that it works within the book. And so she gets to the village, and there are 3 boys that were all born within a week of each other, and all of them are Taviran. And so she realizes that she doesn't know which one of these boys is the dragon reborn. And the village is about to get attacked by bad guys. So she takes all 3 boys and gets them out of the village right as the attack happens. She gets them out of the village and takes them far away so they won't get caught by the Dark One. As she's taking them away, there are two of the main characters are women that are around the age of those boys, but not the same age. And one is younger, one is older. And then those 2 women decide to follow the wizard lady and the boys for their own reasons. One of them is doing it because she thinks the wizard lady is evil, and she feels a protective urge to get those boys back to the village and rescue them from the evil wizard lady. The other girl has her own reason for following them, but nonetheless, they have their own agency, their own reasons for following the wizard lady and doing this. And throughout the course of the story, those 2 women become incredibly important. They both become incredibly powerful wizard ladies themselves, and they are instrumental in the entire plot of the story. They have their own viewpoint chapters. They are very strong women. You would call them girl bosses if you want, whatever the fuck you want to say. But in no sense are these 2 women characters diminished or overshadowed by any of the male characters. this, what I'm trying to get, and I would argue further, like The Wheel of Time is not a book that you would like. It was written in the 80s and 90s, and you would not like, this is not the book that you look at and say, you know, that was written in the 80s and 90s, so it was really like pretty sexist and there wasn't enough like female representation. Like that's just not something you would say about that book. It had a really, probably the most overpowering theme of the book was that men and women have difficulty understanding each other. And from the men's perspective, the women are always confusing and wrong. And from the women's perspective, it's the same way. There was a lot of the humor of the series was based around that, like men being frustrated with women and vice versa. And then there was also the message that that when men and women put aside their differences and work together, then they are the strongest. And that was reflected deeply within the magic system of the story and all of the lore and everything you can imagine. So what am I getting with this? Well, in the show, what did they do in the show? And this is like one of the first things that happens, right? The wizard lady arrives at the village. That's like the beginning of the story. In the show, she arrives at the village, and instead of there being 3 Taviran, there are 5 Taviran. And she says, any of you 5 could be the Dragon Reborn. And so what did they do? So basically the showrunner was like, you know what? We need to signal that we are, you know, that we've got girl bosses. That it could be anybody. The Dragon Reborn might not be a man. It could be any of the 2 women as well. And we're gonna, in the first episode of our show, we're gonna make sure everybody watching knows that we are not misogynists. That women can be powerful too, and we're gonna show that by saying that any of the women could be the Dragon Reborn. Now, okay, fine, like maybe, but first of all, in the book, it is alluded to that it's the Wheel of Time. It's cyclical, and these events keep repeating themselves over and over, slightly different every time. And it's alluded to in the book itself that sometimes the Dragon Reborn is a woman. That does happen. So that does happen sometimes. This story happens to be when a man was a Dragon Reborn twice in a row, but sometimes it is a woman. So, you know, if the show really wanted to do something different and make one of the women the Dragon Reborn, I would have been okay with that. It would have been a pretty weird choice to do it, like to change something so majorly. But if they had done it very like deliberately and cohesively, I would have been okay with it. And it actually, so in the book, you don't find out until at the very end of the book, you discover which of these boys is in fact the Dragon Reborn. And in the show, you discover, like in the second to last or last episode, you discover that in fact the same exact boy who it was in the book is the same one in the show, is the Dragon Reborn. So, you know, if they had hinted at that and then made it so that one of the women was the Dragon Reborn in the show, that would have actually been a really crazy twist for the show to do, and it would have been kind of cool. But no, that's not what they did. They made it out like, well, it could be one of the women, but then it wasn't. So, like, what did that accomplish? In fact, if they were going to make it one of the women, what I think they should have done is had the wizard lady should have said, no, it's one of the boys. And then it ends up being the woman. And then she's surprised too. Like, that would have been better storytelling. The fact that they said, well, it might be one of the women, basically told you that it wasn't going to be. If you read the book, at least, you knew it wasn't going to be. You're like, oh, well, they're not going to do that. And if they were going to do it, they wouldn't have hinted that they're going to do it. They would have surprised you with it. So it was basically just a hollow gesture. It was signaling. It was like just kind of virtue signaling when it didn't need to, because this story has a ton of strong female characters anyway. So it's like, yeah, we're gonna show how like women can be strong too by teasing that it might be a woman, but then it's not. It's like, no, just show the strong women characters anyway. They're already in the story. Like, what are you doing? And it was actually even worse because in the book, the women characters, like the boys were basically just pulled away by the wizard lady. That's why they left the village. And then the two female characters left the village because they had their own reasons, their own motivations. But in the show, that you took that away by making them all just get taken away by the wizard lady. So it was just very stupid. It made no sense. So this is kind of the cardinal sin that I think a bunch of books and movies are doing now, is like there's a lot of rather than just saying, okay, here's the story I'm going to tell and I'm going to write it, and maybe as I write it I'll hit some themes that tend to line up with what I think or whatever. That's inevitably going to happen. Like recently, Andy Weir, the author of the Project Hail Mary, who I hate that guy. I tried reading The Martian. I thought it was absolutely awful and unreadable, and the movie sucked too. So I didn't read Project Hail Mary, but he was like quoted as saying, I don't think books should have any message at all. They should just be entertainment. It's like, yeah, that lines up with my experience of reading your book, actually. So, but he's wrong. Like anything you write is actually going to have a message anyway. And I think the thing to do is like you create your world and your characters and your conflict, and you imagine it, you try to make it as real as you can. You don't need to inject like signaled flat, hey, that's a blue jay, into your story. You don't need to be like, that's a good, this, my hero is good because he randomly encountered a trans woman and everybody in the story was bigoted against the trans woman, but the hero was like, no, that's a woman, guys. Like, if you put that into your story, it just comes like, it's a flat, like, signaling of something. And I noticed that a lot in modern storytelling of like, or you say you have, for example, your story is like taking place back when Black people were slaves, and then you have your like main character who's like a Confederate, like a Confederate guy who would have no real reason to be nice to Black people, and then he suddenly is just nice to Black people. And it's like, it's just kind of like, oh, well, I'm signaling that he's good by giving him an anachronistic like viewpoint that he wouldn't really have had, if that makes sense. Another example from, it's at least 10 years old now, but Ancillary Justice, which won the Hugo, I think. That book, I read it and I didn't really like it. Like, it wasn't really very interesting, and I felt like nothing really happened. And honestly, I feel like that book got most of its acclaim because in that world they created, there were no genders. Everybody was referred to as she, her. And people they just didn't have a concept of gender. And as I mentioned earlier, like, I read the story, I wasn't primed to not like it or anything, but that whole gender thing was one of the only things I remember like hearing about it ahead of time. And I didn't feel like they really explored the idea at all. And actually the author did like nothing with it. There was no like, they didn't explore it. They didn't show it in a way that it felt real at all. It was kind of like, it was honestly a preposterous concept that didn't make any sense. Like, gender gender as a social concept, I think makes sense. I can imagine like you can create a world where gender is simply like my own take on gender stuff is basically that biological sex 100% exists and it's never going to be like invisible, but gender is a construct that you can layer on top of that. And you can imagine like if we weren't so hung up, like when people are trying to make an argument, like when people are trying to say things like trans women are women, I feel that when we try to pretend like biological sex doesn't exist at all, that's a disingenuous argument, and you're weakening your own position by arguing that. And trans women are women. You could make a good argument for that by saying that women, the concept, what we care about when we say the word women is the gender, not the sex. And gender is something that we as a society enforce and codify on various cues, etc. And so you could in theory, like for Anne Leckie's Ancillary Justice, you could try to imagine a society where gender is so like the concept of gender as a social construct is so strong that that's all people actually notice, or that's all people really like refer to when they say when they like look at somebody, I guess. But to just say that everybody's called she and people actually don't even know what somebody's sex is, I actually can't even remember if that's what the book was trying to do with it, because the book did so little with it. But like that's kind of why my idea though is that the book just kind of said like they just treated this as like a throwaway concept to signal to publishers and readers that the book was doing some really interesting thing about gender, or making some kind of point that the gender is just a construct. But it didn't really. It felt like the author was just like signposting it, rather than really deeply baking that into the world that they created. And for me, when you're doing sci-fi or fantasy and you're world building, you like, if you're going to do something like that, you need to do it really well. And what should have happened was that the author did it really well, and it was really interesting. And when you finish the book, you're like, you know what? Now that I've read that book, I have a really different understanding of what gender even actually is. And maybe reading before you read the book, you thought that there's no way that trans women could be women, but then you read that book and and you really think hard about it, and you're like, well, now that I've read that book, I actually see that gender is really different from sex. And if you looked at it in the way that the characters in that society did, I could see how that would be like that. As an example, right? But if you read that book, you don't really come away with it doesn't do anything with it. It's just like, everybody is she. Isn't that clever of me to do that? And it's like, no, it wasn't clever because you didn't execute it. You just signaled it. You said, that's gender. That's my clever idea, gender. It's like, that's a blue jay. There was no like real exploration of the idea. Just like in the Wheel of Time TV show, they had a completely hollow signaling of this, oh, look, everyone's a girl boss. But it's like, no, you didn't need to do that. That was just a pointless change, which was like inciting culture war or something, right? You just get, and that's and then you give the people who say, oh, woke stuff is bad, like, oh, it's bad because it was woke. No, it wasn't bad because it was woke. It wasn't bad because it was trying to say something about gender. It wasn't bad because it was saying women can also be the chosen one. It was bad because it did it in a clumsy, awkward way that contributed nothing to the story. So thanks for watching. Bye.